Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to be looking at Unit 8.7, Global Resistance to Establish Power Structures After 1900. And we're going to start off doing a little skill practice. Our objective today is to explain various reactions to existing power structures in the period after 1900. So we already kind of talked about this a little bit. I just want to kind of run through and kind of just the last video I overlapped a little bit intentionally just for kind of class time coverage. So we've already in the last video I talked about Pinochet. We talked about Uganda a little bit in the last video. Today we're really going to look at, and actually last video we looked at Al-Qaeda. So today in class, depending on whether or not we made it through Al-Qaeda or not, we're gonna spend most or all class on nonviolent reactions to these new power structures. The new post-World War II power structures. But some classes, depending upon where we got, we're gonna do Al-Qaeda. All right. So, so do a little skill practice to start with. All right. So I'm gonna give you a claim or actually, this is what we did yesterday, actually, isn't this what your homework was? I'm sorry. So you're given a claim, right? So after gaining independence from colonial governments, newly created states sought to maintain ties with their former colonial governments. So based on this, how would you use this as evidence to support that claim? So by crediting Muslim and Christian societies working together to develop new, meaningful cultural products. Right, Bella demonstrates a desire to maintain a strong, positive relationship. So this is some sourcing of that document, and then here's a little excerpt that you could use to support this claim, and of course you just need to make that explanation, right? You need to make that explanation, and then for the second document, right here's some ways that you could support the claim with information from the document, and of course, here's some sourcing for you as well. All right. So we're going to talk about South Africa today and apartheid, and so this is one of the things we're going to discuss. But just because I may not have made it through all classes, and if you were here the day before today. And you weren't here today, I want to kind of make sure I cover this real quick. So real quick, responses to power structures. Some are going to be nonviolent, right? Like what we see with Mandela, in the late 80s and early 90s. But you are going to see some violence, right? You are going to see some violent responses to these established power structures that rise up. So, after World War II, right, as a result of decolonization, you are going to see a new kind of power structure that exists. Empires will be eroded, and we're going to get this kind of bipolar world, in that kind of Cold War context, the Soviet Union versus the United States. And then, of course, you have decolonization taking place. You see the fragmentation of all those empires. So, as far as these organizations or these groups that turn to violence in response to this new world reality, need to understand that they, in order for them to be kind of fit into this category of analysis, they need to have an ideological belief system, right? So, Al-Qaeda is not, they're not nihilist, committing violence for the sake of violence, and there's all kinds of these, in class, I will ask, have you ever heard of the IRA, or the Irish Republican Army? And it's been a long time. Since this organization has have kind of been in the news for use of violence, right, in order to resist the established power structures. I think it was George. I'm just kind of I'm winging this off the top of my head here. I think it was George Mitchell, right, is who helped negotiate, the kind of drawing down of tension, between the Irish and the IRA. Right, in the British regime, the British government. And what we see there is an ideological framework why the IRA was committing violence. They wanted kind of unification of the island of Ireland, right? To bring what is under the UK, Northern Ireland, into the Republic of Ireland, right? And right, so there is a kind of a belief system that is associated with them there. And of course, after the negotiations in the mid '90s, you're going to see the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, largely spin off into a political party, right? So when you see Sinn Féin, that's the IRA, right? As a kind of recognized political entity, right? There's all kinds of these organizations, ETA. If you're not familiar with them, that's like a Basque separatist movement in Spain. There's FARC, right? FARC, FARC. If you're not familiar with them, they're in Colombia. And I always kind of like to differentiate them, and kind of differentiate what we mean here by ideological framework. So like FARC, same with Shining Path in Peru. They will advocate the ideology of socialism and redistribution of land to the poor. There is an ideological framework. They are different from the drug cartels, who are simply looking to make money, all right? And sell product, right? So there is an ideological framework with a group like FARC, right, or Shining Path. All right, so the same is true for Al-Qaeda, right? So the question is, first off, what is the ideological framework for Al-Qaeda? And before I get into that, I always kind of ask students, what does Saddam Hussein have to do with Al-Qaeda? What does he have to do with September 11th? And this is something where, because we're in 2021 right now, this is 20 years later, and of course, students weren't even born yet when this happened. So it is kind of important, I guess, and I didn't do this in the last video, so this is why I'm kind of repeating this, is probably need to kind of clarify the events, of what happened in the last 30 years in the Middle East a little bit. So let me just go ahead and do this. All right, so first off, what is the ideological framework for an organization like Al-Qaeda? Salafism is kind of a good starting point if you want to understand that. All right. So, if you want to trace this back further, and then you can go back to the Arabis and going back to the 1870s and the early 1880s when the British eventually will colonize Egypt. You can take it back to Wahhabi, right? And and try to structure the ideological framework of Al-Qaeda into a Wahhabi framework. But Salafism is the generally kind of accepted one, kind of starting point, if you want to kind of make a direct connection. And so the way of looking at this is that there is an ideological continuity that exists between, from the late 1920s with the rise of what becomes known as the Muslim Brotherhood, with Al-Qaeda. All right, so that ideological continuity, right? If you look at the Muslim Brotherhood, they will operate, relatively openly up until the 1950s. Until we see the rise of kind of a military coup under Gamal Nasser. He will overthrow the monarchy in Egypt and push out. The British were largely already out by the 1930s, but kind of push out the last remaining aspects of the British, and of course, nationalizing the Suez Canal. Right, Nasser himself is viewed as too secular. There'll be an attempt on his life, and in response to that, the Muslim Brotherhood will then be pushed underground, where they will continue to exist through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s into the 2000s, right? And they will kind of reappear onto the scene in 2011 with the Arab Spring, right? So as a very well organized group, right, and or political party. In the context of 2011, right? And of course, we see the kind of intellectuals associated with the Salafism movement. They will continue to spread their ideals in the universities, right? In this region, which is where individuals who eventually kind of come through these universities, like Osama bin Laden, who will come into contact with these ideas. And then they'll manifest them. These ideas will then be manifested through organizations like Al-Qaeda. So that's kind of one way to kind of look at where does Al-Qaeda come from, and you do get like a direct line under that viewpoint. That all being said, there are some historians out there, and I'm kind of pulling this off from the Duke University story, and I think I shared this on yesterday's link, so just as a reminder. And he does an excellent job, way better than me, obviously, but he does an excellent job at kind of really exploring in depth the roots here. But from my understanding of kind of the categories analysis that he created with this, is that there's kind of two ways you can kind of look at the rise of Al-Qaeda. One is that direct descent line, and the other is this notion that 1979 is a catalyst year, and the events of 1979 are going to take these Salafist ideas and turn them into a wider movement that that will eventually frame and shape global geopolitics, right? So, and without these events of 1979, Salafism would probably have remained a relatively isolated thing. But because Salafism was established, right, as an ideology, when the events of 1979 do happen, it enables it to spread really rapidly. So I'm just going to run through this idea with you really quick. So first off, what are the three? One is the siege of Mecca, right? So the siege of Mecca, wrap your mind around 100,000 person hostage situation. And of course, the siege of Mecca is going to, kind of change the ideological stance of Saudi Arabia itself, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia itself, and and kind of put them into situations in the coming years that they may not have done before. Okay, you don't often hear about positive Saudi-American relationships in the 1970s, right? Generally the opposite when you're dealing with OPEC, right? But things change, right? In 1979 because of partially because of this event. All right, the next thing is the Iranian Revolution, right? And I think I talked about this yesterday, the whole 79 revolution. And of course, this is, when you talk about this ideology, looking at American imperialism, and dealing with this, the Iranian situation is a unique one because, the Iranian Shah in the mid 1950s does come to power as a result of, kind of a combined effort by British intelligence and American CIA intelligence. And of course the Shah is perpetuated, right, with Western support, and of course the Shah is, once the revolution happens, he's allowed to flee, into the West, right, and is protected. So there is this kind of, Western American kind of, blaming or focus that happens because of the Iranian thing. And of course, there's the Soviet, right, imperialism that gets targeted as a result of the 79 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, right? So the Soviet-Afghan War, and of course, when you talk about Al-Qaeda, this is, Osama bin Laden had already, this, I guess the way I typically would just kind of introduce this in classes, if you don't know who Osama bin Laden is, he comes from a relatively wealthy family from Saudi Arabia, involved in the construction industry. He himself would, could have very easily have simply lived a quiet, comfortable life if he had made that decision to, right? However, because of the ideological framework that he was under as a result of his introduction to Salafism while he was a university student, this is going to compel this kind of a young, comfortably well-off man, into the fields of Afghanistan, right, and working with the Mujahideen, right. So, and this is kind of where Salafism and Bin Laden, get their kind of formal organization, right, practice and application of their beliefs. And I did have a, kind of came up today in class as well, is, that the CIA trained him and supplied him weapons. And I don't really know. I mean, I've never seen that. I know that the Soviet Union is a proxy war. I know that the United States was involved in supplying weapons to the Mujahideen. However, was there any actual direct contact between the CIA and Osama bin Laden? I don't know. I don't know if there was or not. I will say that I was watching that. I think it was Vice, the India-Pakistan video that we watched a few times. And if you watch the, when they're talking about the borders and all that, If you watch the Pakistan side of that, right, they're interviewing one of the former Pakistani generals in the 1980s. And of course, they were the ones who were largely facilitating the movement of the weapons being supplied by the United States in that proxy war. And he was talking as if he had a personal relationship with Osama bin Laden, like he personally knew him. So anyway, so there seems to be a connection between the Pakistani military and Osama bin Laden, just from what I kind of gathered from that interview. But that's as far as I know. All right. Anyway, I digress. Okay. So when you're kind of looking at this, you've got these kind of three major events, right? One is kind of impacting how the Saudis are viewing things. One is this kind of American imperialism reaction going on, and this is the kind of organization of what eventually becomes Al-Qaeda and its leadership, right, with another anti-imperialism focusing on the Soviet Union. While all this is going on as well, right, just kind of make sure we kind of fully set up our contextual framework. You have the Iran-Iraq war going on, immediately after this as well, right? So, if the Afghan war is a proxy war, then the Iran-Iraq war is like a double proxy war, right? So, you don't see the Soviets or the Americans really fighting on any one side of this, but they both are supplying weapons, into this situation. And so, right, and this is a very long and horrific war. So if you want to look at examples of kind of, Cold War era intervention and intensifying conflicts and, intensifying issues that were already existing and just making them worse. This is another really good example, or if you're looking for recruitment opportunities, if you are, promising to do anything anti-Soviet or American, this kind of really horrific, bloody thing is going to be a good recruiting tool, all right? And of course, this is, I think I talked about this last video too. So this whole key thing, simply referring to how children would be, would be martyred, walked in front of tanks so that if the tanks hit a landmine or if the kids hit a landmine, it wouldn't destroy the tank. That way tanks would be maintained in operation. And you can see chemical weapons were used. And, when you hear the stories of the Iran-Iraq war, they're just brutally, really awful to even listen to. All right, so, but anyway, so the Iran-Iraq war is going on, during this entire time frame. So now, when we talk about Al-Qaeda, all right, so let's just kind of make sure we set this up here. So we have the ideology already established. We get the major events of 1979, which then lead to, the Iran-Iraq war, right? And of course, a lot of animosity towards the United States, right, as a result of U.S. intervention. And of course you have, the whole Afghan issue going on with an organizational bent. So once 89 comes around, the Afghan war gets done. We see eventually by the mid-90s, Al-Qaeda is getting up and running and organized in Africa, and they kind of make their first, kind of, jump onto the international scene with the Nairobi bombings of the U.S. embassy there. Things get a little heated, and they eventually end up taking refuge in Afghanistan. The Taliban allows them to set up some training camps there, right? So, and we see shortly after the Kenyan bombings, there's an attack on the USS Cole. So if you've seen this, these are all kind of like, you can easily kind of get news stories on this pretty quick. You've got a pretty simple suicide attack, a couple suicide bombers getting on a small boat, and just going up to a naval ship and self-detonating themselves. Right, and there was a reaction to this. This is very late in the Clinton years, right? So right before the 2000 election between Gore and Bush, right? So this is late Clinton years. You will see a retaliation or response from the United States for this. Tomahawk missiles will be launched into Afghanistan, targeting the Al-Qaeda training facilities there, and that was largely it, right? So that, and the kind of point I kind of try to make here with this is that when the attacks on September 11th happened, right? So, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the Pentagon, and then both of the World Trade Centers. When those four things happen, I very clearly remember, sitting with my students. I was in kind of the northern suburbs of New York, outside of New York City. And I remember sitting with my students that afternoon and having one of them ask me, Mr. CF, do you think it was Al-Qaeda? Right? And the obvious answer there was, I don't know, but that is what was running through all of our minds. So Al-Qaeda was known, very well known, very well established, right, at this point, right? So when you look at what happens next in there. So this is a map kind of looking at 2003. What happens next is Afghanistan, of course, is kind of off this map. There was a period of negotiation that took place between the United States and the Taliban, the government that was controlling Afghanistan. I mean, at the end of the day, we really didn't care about the Taliban. We wanted the people who committed the attacks against the United States, which was Al-Qaeda, right? So Osama bin Laden and his followers. So there were negotiations between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in order to extract, the leadership of that organization out. And the negotiations went on for weeks. They were not fruitful, and the end result was, a few weeks after the September 11th attacks, the U.S. military ended up invading Afghanistan, in order to get access to Al-Qaeda. So that's how the Afghan War begins in 2001. The Iraqi things that kind of started with that picture of Saddam Hussein. The Iraqi thing is not connected to September 11th or Al-Qaeda, but it is also hard to imagine the invasion of Iraq in 2003 happening without the September 11th attacks. So there's it's like a secondary kind of, or an indirect relationship between them. So as a result of the events of September 11th, you're going to see, maybe, I heard it referenced once. Actually, I heard it referenced in a political debate back in 2012 as the Bush Doctrine. And I remember, I'm pretty in tune with the news, and I watch a lot of news. And I remember hearing the question about, do you support the Bush Doctrine and not being asked in a political debate. And I remember never hearing about it before, and I didn't really know what it meant. And then it was clarified, what it meant. It was this notion, and I guess I thought about it when I kind of heard. I was like, are they referring to the State of the Union address that was made by President George H.W. Bush? George W. Bush. The whole you're either with us or you're against us. When he was talking about Iran, North Korea, Iraq, right? So I kind of thought it may have been that, but I just never heard it before, I guess. But anyway, there becomes this kind of ideological framework or a doctrine, a foreign policy doctrine might be a better way to put it. There becomes a foreign policy doctrine that comes in the years following September 11th. And I don't even know if it's still called, people still refer to it as the Bush Doctrine, if that was just something that popped up once in a debate back in 2012. But there was this idea that any country that harbors terrorists, any countries that possess weapons that could be used by terrorists, are then on the side of terrorists, right? And Iraq kind of falls into kind of this whole thing. This new foreign policy outlook, right? So Iraq, just kind of backstory a little bit. Following the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein in the summer of 1990 is going to invade the country of Kuwait, right? So Kuwait's right here. So that was in late July, early August, I don't remember which, of 1990. Following the invasion of Kuwait, George H.W. Bush, right, who was president of the United States at this time, he organizes a pretty large coalition, in using Saudi Arabia as a staging ground. Will in January of 1991, attack Iraq, and then reestablish Kuwait as an independent sovereign state. Right. So, once Kuwait had been liberated, international forces generally withdraw, right? So Iraq is allowed to stay a sovereign country. Saddam Hussein is allowed to stay in power, but there are restrictions being placed, on him after this as part of that peace treaty. And of course, part of that negotiation had to do with allowing United Nations weapons inspectors in. A series of events happened in following following the Afghan invasion that is gonna result in Saddam Hussein restricting access to those investigators. There's going to be a series of pieces of evidence that are going to be materialized for the U.S. government or by the U.S. government or to the U.S. government, and a case is going to start to get made in the fall of 2002 to possibly intervene and invade Iraq. Congress will actually openly debate it, in the kind of late fall of 2002, and Congress will give authorization for an invasion in late 2002. At that point, the Bush administration, this is the George W. Bush administration, President Bush administration, they will then go to the United Nations, where I believe it was Colin Powell, if my memory is serving me right. Colin Powell will make the case for a U.S. intervention in Iraq. The United Nations does not think the evidence that was presented to them was compelling, and a decision is made to not support the U.S. in its endeavors in Iraq. The United States, develops its own coalition of countries that are willing to join the United States, and an invasion does take place, where a search is then made to support the claims that have been made by the United States to justify the entrance into Iraq. The evidence that is sought out fails to materialize, and the justification for going into Iraq generally falls short of being supported with evidence. Okay, all right. So that's kind of how we kind of lead into kind of the Iraq thing. So what does Saddam Hussein have to do with Al-Qaeda in September 11th? Nothing. That said, his overthrow, it's kind of hard to disconnect it from the events of September 11th, right? As a result. Okay, and I think I talked about this last video, so I'm going to kind of move on here. I'm not going to talk about the Arab Spring again. All right, so moving on. Nonviolence, right? Nonviolence movements, and I've probably gone too long again, and so I'm gonna just kind of move on here, right? So I'm gonna do this relatively quick. So Nelson Mandela, right? So examples of non-violence responses to kind of the new political arrangements that existed in the post-World War II world. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr. These are two really good examples, well-known examples. All right, so just as a kind of a reminder, there is a Cold War context for what happens with Nelson Mandela. Of course, Nelson Mandela will be put into prison. And of course, that's where the Cold War context is. There's a connection between his organization and the KGB. And of course, the CIA will be responsible for giving the South African regime the tip-off about Mandela, where he was. And of course, Mandela was involved in he wasn't always nonviolent, let's put it that way. He was involved in organization and the planning of a violent overthrow of the South African regime. All right, so this is an image from Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela spent 27 years. So I generally kind of, when we look at this, we introduce this topic, we'll kind of look at this and just kind of see if we can identify who the B and C's are, right? Kind of just so we start to use this language, right? So people of South Asian descent, right, or mixed racial category here. So mixed African with the European descent, or mixed Asian with South Asian with European descent. And Bantus is referring to people of African descent. Okay. All right. So when you think about what apartheid is, the imagery should look pretty familiar to anyone who is from the United States and is familiar with Jim Crow laws and segregation policy. So the imagery is not that shocking, right? It is familiar. The thing is when you talk about South Africa and apartheid, The level of intensity of these laws is much stronger, than what we had seen in the United States, and it's largely probably to do with population. You got a much smaller percentage of the population of European descent ruling over the vast majority of the economic wealth and all the political power, right? So the tools of control are going to be doled out a little more harshly, much more so than what we ever see in the United States, right? During those eras, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Right. So the three primary tools that we're going to be looking at is the past laws, the Bantu homelands, and the forced migrations or the forced removals. All right. And so when we kind of look at the timeline, where these things fall into this timeline, most of the kind of harsher ones come in the post-World War II world or in the decolonization era. All right. So they are, these very strict restrictions do happen within the context of decolonization. Maybe it's fear, right? Maybe it's fear of the ideas of decolonization spreading, and this idea of self-rule of indigenous populations. But we do see loose framework of these policies happening, shortly after, self-governance starts in South Africa. So land is taken away from people of African descent early on, and of course, all political rights are stripped away as well. Right, so you do have kind of a framework before the war, but as soon as World War II is done and we start getting into this kind of decolonization phase, you're going to see, the establishment of these laws. Okay, so specifically the pass laws. So let's kind of start with that really quick. What the pass law intends to do is to restrict the mobility of individuals within the country. And when we start talking about making people having passports to travel inside their own country, we almost always kind of look at this as an example of an autocratic regime. We typically associate that kind of stuff with the Nazis did that kind of stuff to restrict the movement of the Jews. We see this under the Soviet Union. Anytime you start talking about making people show passports, right, or passes inside your own country, this is almost always viewed as a step towards authoritarianism, clear violations of civil liberties and individual choices, individuals' ability to make their own decisions for themselves, right? So, never a good step when you see this happening in your country. And even though South Africa is a democracy, it's only a democracy for a small percentage of the population. So, yes, this is a major autocratic step. So, passports for internal travel, not good, right? A classic measure of control, all right? The next thing we see here is the establishment of these Bantu homelands, right? So, and of course, this is going to be working in conjunction with these passes. Right, so we have these homelands that are created, and these homelands, once they are created, you'll then need a passport to get out of them, right? To be able to travel within them. You definitely can't go from one homeland to a different homeland without a pass or permission to move, right? So really, we're talking about isolating individuals, right? Isolating individuals into these little pockets, and of course, as things progress to this, you are going to see a movement, so that when we have unrest in the urban areas, you're going to see the forced removal of people from these cities, from the urban areas to these homelands, and as part of this, you're also going to see individual citizenship from South Africa removed as well. So once you're moved onto a homeland, you lose your South African citizenship, which then means you lose your South African passport, which means you cannot travel internationally. So because of the pass system, right, you can't travel internally, and because of the forced removals onto the Bantu homelands, you can't travel externally. So you are literally locked into place here under this. All right, so let's kind of insert, now that we've kind of talked about the means of controls under apartheid within the South African regime, let's look at Mandela. So feel free to pause and read through this. And of course, he is part of an organization, right? The ANC. But eventually he comes to transcend that organization. He becomes a little bigger than it for a moment. All right, so when we talk about how this system gets broken down, it's not all Mandela. There is a series of events that raises international concern of what's going on in South Africa. This is going to result in external pressure being placed to bear on the South African regime, right? Combine that with Mandela, then we're going to have kind of a pretty powerful multi-pronged movement. All right. So I guess specifically what we're referring to here is in 1960s we have the Sharpeville massacre, right? So the Sharpeville massacre is going to result in the death of 69 people. This is people who are protesting the past system, right? The past system. That's what they're protesting. In 76 we're going to see the Soweto uprising. This is a student movement. And I'm pretty sure I've already put the video on the website, but there is a video on this. And it's a pretty cool video because they have the photographer who took that photograph, as well as the girl whose younger, her 13-year-old brother was killed. So please watch that. It's a pretty powerful piece. Okay. So this, of course, is going to get international attention. To kind of mobilize people against apartheid. Stephen Biko, is another kind of majorly, internationally known incident. And of course, by the time we get into the midnight 1980s, we see a growing anti-apartheid movement outside, in Europe, in the United States. And by the mid-1980s, you have most Western countries deciding to politically and economically isolate South Africa as long as they politically and economically isolate their own population. All right? So that political and economic isolation, right, as long as it's going on internally, then the South African regime is going to face it externally. All right, so at that point, the South African government needs to make a decision. Do they continue? Do they push forward and maintain their system amid this divestiture movement that was going on, or do they change? And we see in the late 80s a change take place under F.W. de Klerk. F.W. de Klerk will institute a series of reforms that will eventually result in the release of Nelson Mandela in February of 1990, and then a gradual loosening of the voting restrictions, so that by the time we get to the 1994 election, this is a truly democratic election in South Africa. The results of the democratic election is the ANC, right, will win a majority of the seats, right, and in the legislature, and Mandela will be elected as president of South Africa. There's tons of good movies, that have been made about this over the years. Some are older, some are newer, and of course, there's plenty of good kind of news footage as well. Sometimes I show that kind of stuff in class, like the Nelson Mandela, the president. It's like an ABC News clip. All right. So anyway, that kind of brings us to Mandela. All right. As far as the consequences of this, right? When you look 10 years down the line, or 8 years down the line, right? As what impact has been made by having a more representative democracy? What changes have happened, in the years following, the election of Mandela? The answer is, kind of like asking someone from China about Cultural Revolution. It's complicated, right? So, when you have to kind of look at the long-term implications of this, we're still kind of dealing with this. But South Africa is not, not a pure success story. There's a lot of internal issues in South Africa that are kind of working their way through at this point. So, what are the implications of this? It is, time will tell. All right. All right, so this is kind of a good little point here to do a quick little visual analysis, sourcing analysis here. Right, so Nelson Mandela in his former jail cell in Robben Island, right, elected president. After he was elected president in '94. So try to source this in a way. Try to source this in one way. So go ahead and pause and try that. And here are some possible, kind of ways that that you may have come up with to do this, and then based on this, then you can kind of quick and easily turn that into a source. All right, I think that is all for today. I think I've probably gone a little too long, as always. So here's our debrief and summary. Some nationalist military leaders use violence to overthrow established power structures. Pinochet we talked about in the last video, right? Franco in Spain. Amin we talked about a little bit in the last video as well. Some leaders use nonviolence. So we've talked about Gandhi already and his nonviolence movement. I'm assuming you understand and know about Martin Luther King, which is why we focused on Mandela today. Right, and then some groups will turn to violence to challenge established power structures, and we mentioned all these, and we developed Al-Qaeda. Okay, so that is all for today. All right, stop reality.